So thank you all for coming. I'm very, very happy to be the person who's facilitating this session because I've been a huge fan of Cate Kennedy's for some time. I've been watching her, as I imagine most of you have, emerge as indeed one of our very best short story writers. She's been doing the hard yards, really, over what, 15 years, I think.
Guess, yeah. But it's all a pleasure. It's not hard yards. It's
and winning award after award after award, local ones, national ones, being published in the New Yorker. She gets better and better. Her stories get stronger and stronger. And last year, I think it was last year, no, about 3 years ago, Scribe published her first collection of stories, all of which had been anthologised widely, and all of which are wonderful. The very first one in this collection happened to be my favourite, which was the story I first discovered Cate Kennedy from, and I think you won the Age Short Story Award with it.
That's right.
in 2001 or 2 or something.
Yes.
And it's called after John Donne. It's a stunning, stunning story. What Thou and I Did Till We Loved. It's one of those special stories of Cate's where she drills down to the magic moment where everything shifts. She has a kind of Alice Munro feel about her with these stories, which I adore Alice Munro, I'm sure all of you do, and Cate is ours, so I'm very proud to be here. But a small confession, when I heard on the grapevine that Cate had written a big fat epic novel, and it was about hippies, and it was about women stranded in small country towns years on, my heart sank because I was frightened for her. I've, over a very long period of time, watched writers think there is a hierarchy, that you write short stories, but the real thing is the novel, and you have to progress from the short story to the novel. And it's very difficult to do, and a lot of people don't do it, or end up not being able to write good short stories again. Now, when I read The World Beneath, all of those fears dropped away, and I realised I was entirely wrong, because Cate's skill as a storyteller takes her right into the terrain where she couldn't go with her short stories because you can only have one point of view in a short story, but she's working with many points of view in this remarkable novel. So, Cate, over to you. How do you do it? Why did you do it? Were you frightened of doing it, or did you just leap in?
I do all of those things. I guess, like anybody who's ever written a novel, it is with some trepidation, I think. And having come from the short story world, I know how much work is involved thinking about narrative and thinking about finding those moments and where that little story arcs, as you said so beautifully, it is drilling down to a spot. I almost think it's like drilling down like into a tooth sometimes, you know, that you need to find that little kind of nerve end or that little bruise or that ouch that we all recognise.
But it's not obvious.
That's not obvious at
staring
first.
You in the face. It's something
as it's just not obvious often to the character or the protagonist that you're writing about. So I knew how much work was involved. I knew I'd spend a long time, you know, really learning how to juggle, really, I guess, with short stories. I felt like I'd learned that craft, but I was a bit nervous, I must say, because I just knew how much work would be involved trying to elaborate on those sorts of ideas to juggle 10 balls, in fact, rather than 3, I guess.
Did you start with one particular ball? Tell us
Yes,
tell us the balls, the 3 generations.
I did start with one particular ball. I wanted to write about a triangle of 3 people. So what interested me a lot was the kind of, how can we write about something that's dysfunctional? This is a lovely shift, it seems to me, to think about and write about. When something is off kilter or something is stuck or in stasis and it can't by itself get itself unstuck, how are we going to create a story which is going to pull people or push people or jolt people or jar them out of that sort of stasis, just as happens in real life where we're stuck for a long time in something and then events almost against our will or that don't seem like the right ones or don't seem like the one that's going to be the thing to kind of free us up, by some strange and miraculous process, the thing we want the least becomes the thing which kind of forces us out of that state. And that really interested me, to write about people who, for all sorts of reasons, or one, but, you know, nostalgia seemed to me a fantastic driver for this story.
And did you start with a moment, or did you start with a character? Did Sophie trigger it?
No, you know, it's interesting. It was the parents, and the parents in this book, Rich and Sandy, have met each other. And I wanted to have something big that they'd met each other at, something that was a kind of defining thing for them. where they felt they had purpose and they felt they had a cause bigger than themselves, because everything after that has been downhill. I know plenty of people like that. My generation, in fact, in a nutshell.
Not just your generation. No. Anyone who's been around political excitement has this terrible withdrawal.
They had terrible withdrawal, that's right. And you try and detox from that kind of terrific sense of being out on the edge. So I picked what I really saw from my own, perspective and generation as being quite a defining time, which was the Franklin River blockade in Tasmania in 1983, which I remember very vividly.
Were you there?
I was there, but I wasn't there as a blockader. I went down because I was studying journalism at college, at uni, and me and a couple of other students went down to interview some of the blockaders. And then we came back, as many of the blockaders did too, back to uni and back to try and live ordinary life. But of course, later that year, there was an election. And the first words, if you remember, that Bob Hawke said as he got up onto the podium, having just been elected, was, "The dam will not go ahead." Yeah. And I remember feeling, as a young 20-year-old or something, the blockade did that. That's what happened. It was like you'd actually changed this thing. So I wanted them to be involved in that. And I had a sort of a basic idea of that generation of people, since it's my own, and I knew that I wouldn't have to do such a lot of research because I remembered the songs that were there and I remembered what happened and the sort of lives that we were living around that time. So I wanted them to have that big experience and then to have found a restlessness or perhaps a stuckness ever since. And then I thought, what if people like that had actually had a child? And I did know plenty of people in my life who had teenage children, and the children seemed to often, occasionally, be the sort of kids who kind of had to parent themselves because their parents were stuck, or they didn't want to see that they were kind of going through different eras of their life, and now was the time they were going to stop worrying about their own lives and start focusing on their children. So
and they were stuck because of something that had happened to them?
Yes, that's right.
The disappointment,
that's
or
right.
More than that, do you think? Because there's so much, everyone's disappointed at some point.
Everyone's disappointed, but it did seem to me that part of nostalgia is a kind of a narcissism. I suppose that you can never stop gazing into that photo album like it was a little pond, just like Narcissus in the myth. And then I began to think about those myths, those ancient Greek myths, and I was looking all the time for something bigger to kind of hang that larger narrative on, and I kind of thought about all those myths. And I was just lucky that I kind of then thought about the idea of the underworld, I suppose, and how it does seem to me that the more I read about the underworld, actually, the Greek underworld, I don't know if you've done much reading on it yourself, and that's why the book is called The World Beneath, because it's looking at what's underneath the surface of our lives. The underworld is not like the Judeo-Christian hell, where you kind of burning in flames of torment for eternity. It's a place where people live, and they live in this kind of half-awake state of forgetfulness, of sort of wandering around aimlessly. And I thought, yeah, that's the world I want to explore. That does feel like contemporary life lots of times, You forget what it was that your purpose was. You forget. You just feel this kind of vague sense of dissatisfaction. And for the Greeks, that was hell. That was what hell was, to be in that state of unawareness that we're never going to recover from unless we wake up to ourselves. And I thought, yeah, that's a nice thing to kind of hang the story on. So it all kind of progressed from there.
And Sandy and Rich are very stuck.
Yes.
Tell us about them. They're the parents.
They're the parents. Well,
this remarkable 15-year-old girl who we'll get to in a minute.
Who we're going to get to in a minute, yeah. Well, Sandy's kind of stayed stuck living in a country town, and she's still, I guess, in that state where she's working. She has a stall at the market. She's interested in the new age. She is waiting for her chance to get her own life started, even though she's now in her mid-40s. And she's a little bit credulous, I guess. She kind of believes anything. Whereas Rich, they've been estranged since Sophie was a little baby. Rich has got that kind of restlessness that you see where I suppose now would call it commitment phobic. But that kind of thing of the person who can't stop, and they have an idea about themselves. He has an idea about himself. He's a kind of like a photojournalist. He wants to be a well-known photojournalist of some kind, or a photographer. And he's never actually... So he actually works in putting together advertorials for daytime TV, but that doesn't stop him. He has this idea of himself as being more remarkable than his life has panned out for him, and he sort of is very cynical. So you have this kind of polarised perspective, and I was interested to think what sort of daughter would come from those two extremes.
And Richard left when Sophie was
just a few months old, I guess. Yeah, that's right.
And because Sandy had told him to go.
That's right. They've been estranged all her life. And now she's 15 and Richard decided suddenly he wants to re-establish those connections and to try and reconnect with her and patch up that estranged state that they're in. And so he invites her to come with him on a bushwalk to Cradle Mountain, Lake St Clair, where he can perhaps revisit his time of former glory. So that's what kind of kicks the whole story off, is that decision to go into the wilderness, which of course is a classic mythic theme as well.
And Sandy's beside herself at the thought of handing over her precious daughter to this hopeless layabout husband as she sees him. And the girl that turns up for Rich, describe her. She's wonderful.
She's not what he expects, that's for sure. Sophie's 15 and she's... I just find teenagers quite kind of terrifyingly well-informed and terrifyingly right about so many things. I don't have a teenage daughter, but I know plenty of kids this age.
They can see through to the bone.
They can, and they're so connected with everything, and they're so... They sort of often feel... Well, this girl particularly, she's a sort of a goth or emo goth, as her teachers insist upon labelling her. And she's got that kind of simmering fury at everything because of her situation where she has to be like a mother to her own mother, I guess.
And so she's very clever, and she has a website that her mother doesn't know anything about. Yeah. The teachers at school will show her, called My Crap Life. So poor Sandy's confronted by
poor Sandy, she's only got dial-up at home. And so there's one stage in the story where she's heard the teacher say that her daughter's emo goth, and she's gone to Google and she's typed in Elmo goth, wondering what that might be. So it's kind of like you've got two people who I guess are quite hapless and are floundering. And all the things we do to kind of disguise paper over the fact that we feel out of control of our lives and floundering in our lives. Well, I guess the message is don't go out to the wilderness where you're out of your comfort zone, because all those things are going to come sort of rushing in to confront you. Yeah.
Now read for us.
I'll read a little something for you. Okay. Which bit will I read? I'll read the little bit where Sophie is wanting to talk to Rich about why he left. Because, when you're walking along, you're sort of clomping along, and you're hoping for those chances to actually ask what's happening. And they have that moment, but being they're keeping missing all these chances of possibly connecting. And so they're having a conversation, and what we go into Rich's head, and we hear what it's like when they broke up. That one first.
Meanwhile, Sandy is just described where Sandy is.
She's gone to a Reclaim Your Inner Goddess workshop.
Because she's terrified at the thought of course, of delivering Sophie to this hapless father that she hasn't seen for 14 years.
To go into the underworld. And of course, if anyone's read any Greek mythology, you'll realise that in a playful way, it won't be any surprise to find that the only goddess card left for Sandy at the workshop is Demeter. Well, that's why she's so terrified.
Artemis. She wanted the others.
So when I read that one first, I'll read the one about I'll read the one just to give you a sense of how Rich thinks. When he tries to tell Sophie about how the birth was, so you see the conflict between Sandy and Rich, and I'm just apologising right now for my language because they do swear. They do swear.
And Sophie's asked the question,
yes,
hasn't she? Yes,
that's right. She asked the question, and she says, "How'd you meet Mum?" She said after a while. He glanced at her with an ironic, preoccupied smile. She could hear how he had to catch his breath before answering. "She's never told you?" She said, "You just hung around until you moved in." What a total crock. "Hey, I'm just kidding. She said you met up by coincidence after the blockade and you moved into the share house she lived in." He sniffed and nodded. "Yeah, that's right. We got together briefly in Strawn, then we caught up by chance later. And she says it was this great communal house and you're all activists." Well, I guess that about sums it up. Then we moved up to the country. Esborough was a pretty quiet old town back then. He paused and concentrated on the track for a moment. "My father always tells me we could have made a packet in real estate if we'd seen the writing on the wall. But I never wanted to buy into any of that stuff. Something in me just needed to keep on the road." She waited for him to go on. She waited to hear him say, "I never wanted to leave," or "If I had my time over again, I'd do things differently." Anything. But he just walked a little faster as they reached a section of duckboard, stepping ahead of her with that twitchy limp so she couldn't see his face, presenting her with nothing but his blank, uncommunicative back. And now we hear what Rich has to think about it. She was going to ask him about his mother, Rich thought with heavy, dread-filled certainty, as he moved ahead of her, hoping to put her off. That's what she'd slowed down for, to interrogate him and blast him with uncomfortable questions. He could feel the silence building and wondering how to deflect it, the question when it came. And sure enough, it was as if he had willed it. What about your mum? Her voice hesitant but determined behind him. Oh, she's still alive, he said neutrally. Why do you ask? I'm just wondering, she's sort of my other grandmother after all. Apart from Janet, you mean? How is old Janet? He heard her short, humorless laugh as their feet clopped along the duckboards. Old, she said. Still going strong? She's only 73. She runs her local U3A group. Oh, I bet she does. I bet she runs it like Colonel Clink. She drives Mum mad. Still. Then again, if she didn't try to run Sandy's life, she'd have nothing to live for, would she? U3A must come a distant second. He started to tell her about how Janet used to come to visit them in Ayresville and insist upon staying at the local motel rather than in their spare room. Like we had bed bugs or something, he said. And before you were born, holy God, you should have heard her when we said he wanted to have a home birth. She didn't say anything for a while, and he was hoping she'd forgotten her original question. He heard her say almost conversationally, Mum says you didn't support her in having a home birth. What? She said, what? He turned his head so sharply he felt something in his neck pop. No, wait. She said you didn't have the strength to offer her the support she needed. Now hold on a frickin' minute there. I can't believe just been that kind of holier-than-thou crap to you. Well, actually I could. That'd be bloody typical. He was hammering along now, his blood pressure mysteriously up, fighting the urge to wheel her out and grab her by the shoulders and make her see how it had been for him. She's the one who couldn't go through with it, Sophie. She was also gung-ho for it, and I was behind her 100%, believe me, but that first sign of a contraction, and she was screaming, yelling at me to get her to the hospital. He wasn't embellishing it at all. He remembered it vividly. She dropped the idea of a home birth as if it was radioactive. Okay, Sophie said, her face pinched. I'm just telling you what she said. I'm not putting your mother down, he said, sounding as calm and reasonable as he could in spite of his indignation. But she... How can I put this? She liked the idea of being an Earth mother better than she liked the actual process. I mean, it sounds good, doesn't it? A drug-free birth, till you're actually in it. She tried, though, to do the right thing. Strange little flashes of defensiveness in her, that stalwart loyalty. Of course she did, he agreed at once. I'm not saying that. She'd set him off now, remembering all of Sandy's exasperating contradictions. He walked along for a while, weighing up Sophie's allegiances. She was always a great one for starting great schemes, he said finally. Making soap, spinning, that was a big one. Homemade candles. One time, she started researching how to build a geodesic dome in the backyard. She'd seen one somewhere. She started making it out of, bamboo or something. This time, he heard a snort of laughter, and he turned to see her grinning, eyes on her feet but smiling. Well, it's still there, she said. And he thinks a bit more about other stuff, and he says, so Sandy blamed him for the caesarean as well as everything else. He should have seen the warning signs, probably, the inevitable sappy cliches, Sandy talking about how children were the glue that held communities together and offering to babysit for friends and fervently telling them that it took a village to raise a child. They're starting to go quiet when he talked about them selling the house and heading off to live somewhere else for a few years. The South Pacific, he remembered suggesting, or Kerala. She had taken the decision out of his hands in the end, of course, not long after she'd turned 30, 1993. Entered nearly a decade of easy harmony and tacit understanding on a whim, on something that looked a lot to him like peer group pressure. Dragged him along for the ride. No more joints for a while, she'd said one night, and he'd said distractedly, really, how long? And she'd given him a nervous smile and said 9 months, and he'd felt his stomach drop through the floor like an elevator with a snapped cable. You could profess yourself delighted, feel in fact a surging kind of fleeting paternal pride, but there was no hiding that initial stomach plummet he could recall now, the wave of panic-stricken nausea reaching towards his throat with its sticky, enmeshing fingers. He'd felt protective at first, after he'd got over the initial shock, keen to give it all a go, willing to constantly give Sandy the reassurance she needed and allay the naked fears she confided to him in their bed in the dark. He couldn't believe how quickly she could go from her blithe, serene confidence in front of their friends during the last months of her pregnancy to the blind, gabbling panic once they'd left. We're having it here at home, she'd insist to their friends. They turned to glance at him for confirmation. Right here on the living room floor, he remembered, echoing brightly, spreading his hands in an encompassing gesture that took in the rug and the throw cushions. Maybe starting off from the bath, Sandy had continued. We've got the pregnancy bath oil, lavender. Her face, when he sneaked a glance at her, was a calm oval of anticipation. The midwife's coming over, the one I met at the prenatal yoga. You seem incredibly centred, friends would murmur. Well, it's not as if birth's a medical procedure. It's just the patriarchy that's told us that. Then after they'd gone, she'd lie panting, trying to wriggle herself into a curled position. Rich, I can't sleep. Is the baby kicking? Sometimes he kicks all night, sometimes he doesn't, and then I'm too scared. I think his heart stopped. I just lie there praying and try not to cry for hours. What if his heart stopped? Maybe he's just sleeping. Put your hand here. Feel that? That's his head. Jesus, I'm crazy. I have to push that out. It's going to bloody rip me in two, isn't it? No, it won't. Women since the beginning of time have given birth the way you want to. What do you mean the way I want to? He hesitated. It sounded terribly like a trick question. Like you just said tonight, not controlled by the patriarchy, drawing on your own empowerment. You'll be fine. You think it's going to be fine. You fucking give birth then, you asshole. Gosh, it was like Sally Field playing Sybil. Well, calm down and don't worry. You're just nervous. Anyone would be nervous. It's a huge thing. Don't patronise me. Just leave me alone. He'd talk her back into it, cajole her with images of the two of them birthing their child together with the baby born into candlelight and lavender, the warm bath and her own endorphins providing natural pain relief. He'd recite it all back to her like a litany, and after a while she'd relax and sleep the sleep of the dead for the rest of the night. And he'd listen to her softly snoring, and the thought would skitter around his mind like the panic-stricken moth at the window, bashing itself to death trying to get out. This is my life now. He'd lie there listening to it, blundering again and again into the glass, not getting it. My bam, life bam, now.
It's fabulous. It's fabulous. Yeah.
So you can see their conflict, can't you?
Absolutely.
Yes.
But the thing that's so striking, Kate, is how empathetic you are to both of them. I mean, you don't write him off. He is a sad sack and a hopeless dad and all that stuff, and off he goes. And we see him being a hopeless father trying on the trail when he takes the daughter through the Cradle Mountain Wilderness trail. And we see Sandy at her most ridiculous, selling at the market and doing all those things. But you're never caricaturing them. They're real people with real desires to be in touch with a bigger truth, a greater truth than
they are struggling.
Yeah.
And, you know, and I suppose I do feel it's a risky thing to try and do, isn't it?
Yes,
because it's very easy to...
These people are often caricatured.
They're often caricatured. And I almost wanted the reader to feel at the beginning kind of dismissive, I guess, that we were ready to pigeonhole them the way we do to people in real life. And say, yes, I've got them kind of marked. I know what they're like now. In fact, a lot of people under 30 haven't got that sense. They think... One person told me he thought they were monsters of caricature.
Oh.
Someone who's about 23 told me that. So. And I was like saying, you need to live another decade more before you can...
Yes.
That I wanted people to feel at first that they were almost caricatures, but then as you got to know them during the book, the thing that happens in real life happened, where you begin to realise... You almost feel a bit chastened, I guess, that you have been a bit quick to judge. That's right.
Exactly.
And that you begin to realise everyone has got all these layers and all these kind of deep things which are driving them. And it doesn't make them less lovable, the fact that they're so...
They're not cardboard cutouts that have invented themselves.
That's
They've
right,
got parents that have done things to them,
and we begin to see that generational thing that's happened to them.
There are wonderful grandparents. I mean, they're terrifying grandparents in this novel, but they're remarkable, and they provide the keys to seeing Sandy in a sympathetic light. Tell us about her mother, Janet.
We don't see too much of Janet, but we don't need to, because she's got like a constant voice in Sandy's head all the time. You know how that thing is where you don't need someone else to repress you because you're perfectly equipped to repress yourself.